Good afternoon. My name is Sam Clover. I'm the senior minister here at Greenville Community Church. It's so great to see all of you here for a very special event. I started here as senior minister just this past August, and shortly after my call here was announced, my co-organizer, Manfred Phillip, got in touch with me at my last church and said, we had been planning to do an event on Dietrich Bonhoeffer back in April of 2020 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of his death. Well, we know what happened in the spring of 2020. COVID shut down everything, so that was delayed. And after Manfred reached out to me, I said, absolutely, I would love to do this, so let's make it happen. And we think it is a wonderful and important time for this to happen because of so much that's going on in our culture, in our society. We all know that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an outspoken advocate against anti-Semitism and against authoritarianism. And at this time, over the last few years in which anti-Semitism has been rising, we thought this was a very important time to do this. Just a little quick bit of history. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a very interesting and little-known connection to Greenville Community Church. When he came to study at Union Theological Seminary in New York City back in 1930 and 31, he befriended a family of this congregation, the Erns family. And they ended up lending him their old Oldsmobile, which Bonhoeffer drove through the South and to Mexico, and then came back with some gifts to the family, and one of the gifts was passed on to us at the church, which is this Native American drum that is in my office. So it's kind of it's a tangible connection with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We have some wonderful scholars here who will each speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have a little Q&A at the end of our program today. But first, before we get into that, once again, I want to thank Mark Lowe's, our pianist, for giving of his time today. And without further ado, I'd like to invite up my co-organizer, Manfred Phillip.
Thank you so much. I just want to say a few words. I wanted to, first of all, thank all the speakers for coming. It's important that you be here. I noticed that Astrid Storm and Eliza Davies from a neighboring church, St. James the Less, are here. I'd like to welcome you to this event. Thank you for coming. I particularly like to thank David Gill, the Consul General of Germany, for coming here. It's my understanding that you're not going to be here in New York forever, and so the day will come. David is the one who's been, every time I see him, when are you going to do the Bonhoeffer event? He says this all the time, and so if I were part of this, he's very much more a part of this. Now, after I stop speaking, I'm going to disappear down there because I have to do something about the Zoom link for this event, and I have to take care of that. So if I disappear, it's not because I'm trying to ignore this event. So without any further ado, David, I'm so happy that you're here.
Good afternoon, distinguished speakers, dear Minister Clover, lieber Manfred Phillip, dear guests. One of the particular duties of the German Consulate General here in New York relates to the darkest time of history in Germany. Due to the great number of Jews who live in the region, many German Jews who fled Nazi Germany or came here much earlier, and thousands of Holocaust survivors from all European countries, remembrance, keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive, teaching future generations the lessons of suppression and resistance, and working for reconciliation are often present in our work. Part of this remembrance is also to remember those who resisted the Nazi regime. Our auditorium at the Consulate General in New York is named after one of my predecessors, Otto Karl Kiep, who was the German Consul General in New York from 1931 to 1932. He was murdered by the Nazis as well as one of the brave people involved in the failed plot of July 20, 1944 against Hitler. And so I didn't hesitate when Manfred Philipp asked me to take part in the commemoration of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as you heard already 3 years ago. Yes, it is important to remember people like Bonhoeffer, who influenced the way our world developed and who are inspirations for generations following them. The fact that he was a man of faith does not limit interest in him to a religious audience. And therefore, I am here as representative of the Federal Republic of Germany to say thank you to those who keep his memory alive here in Scarsdale and elsewhere. What is it that makes Bonhoeffer so important, even for generations who were born decades after his violent death? Well, I'm not a Bonhoeffer expert, and therefore I'm looking forward to this afternoon where we will hear some answers to these questions by scholars who studied Bonhoeffer extensively. For now, I would like to talk briefly about Bonhoeffer's influence in the context of 3 very different autobiographical recollections. Despite the oppression of religion in East Germany, I grew up in a lively Protestant environment. My father was a Moravian minister in the east of Saxony, close to the Polish and Czechoslovakian border. The Moravian congregation in East Berlin, which I joined when I moved there to study theology, had found a new home in the early 80s of last century. Until then, they had celebrated their services in a shack-like building after the Berlin Wall not only divided the city, but also our congregation. And the church building in the west of the city was no longer accessible for the congregants from the east. Our new church hall was part of a newly built church center of the Protestant Church, and it was named after Dietrich Bonhoeffer. During the Peaceful Revolution in the end of 1989, our church hall and the Bonhoeffer House became the place of a truly important historical event which shaped my country and whole Germany. On December 7 of 1989, the first so-called Round Table in East Germany met there, the institution of transition with representatives of the old regime and the new political movements. This panel discussed the further political developments in Germany, how to govern, how to share power, but also how to dissolve the old repressive apparatus, including the Stasi, and how to organize democratic elections. There could not have been a better place to meet for this task than the one which bears the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the man who preached that it is the calling of Christianity to oppose dictatorship, suppression, and ideological supremacy, and that we have to act on behalf of those who are weakened. At the peak of a peaceful revolution, Bonhoeffer's name was very visible. Von guten Mächten wunderbar geborgen erwarten wir getrost, was kommen mag. That was a favorite modern hymn I remember we sang in our congregations, particularly on New Year's Eve, but also throughout the year. And I didn't know that it will be printed in the program with a beautiful translation. The first sentence I translated not as beautifully as in the program. By loving forces wonderfully sheltered, we await confidently what may come. Bonhoeffer had written this song of deep faith and trust in God in 1944 as a man who had been imprisoned on a personal command of Hitler. He had good reason to be desperate, despondent, and fearful. But his strength in dark times, expressed in wonderful poetry and simple words, gave many Christians hope, comfort, courage, trust, and relief when they faced difficult times until today. And finally, I want to mention another facet of Bonhoeffer, which inspires me as a diplomat. About 15 years ago, my family found one of our favorite vacation spots, a small island in the North Sea off the shore of Denmark called Færøerne. What I learned at my first visit there is that Færøerne was the place of an ecumenical conference in 1934, which Bonhoeffer attended as a European Youth Secretary of the ecumenical movement. At this conference, Bonhoeffer was very open with his criticism of the Deutsche Christen, the majority of the German Protestant churches which followed and supported Hitler. And he aroused attention with a morning prayer reflection regarding the true nature of peace, which is, according to Bonhoeffer, much more than just safety. As a convinced ecumenist, his vision was of a global interdenominational Christian unity, which would be a powerful agent of peace and reconciliation for the world. In a time when international experience and cooperation was not as common as today, Bonhoeffer was a proponent of it, indeed, and inspires us until today. But now I'm looking forward to what we will hear about Bonhoeffer, the force of God. And I wish you and all of us an inspiring afternoon. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite forward the first of our three speakers today, Dr. Gary Dorian. It's wonderful to have you here, Gary. I am a graduate of Union Theological Seminary, where Bonhoeffer studied, and Gary has been on the faculty there for several years, and I had him in a wonderful class, so it's great to be back together. Gary.
Further away. Whoops, no. Thank you, Sam. Well, good afternoon, friends. It's a great delight for me, a great privilege to be here this afternoon. I'm grateful to Manfred and Sam and David and everyone else who had something to do with putting together this forum. I was curious just to see where Sam ended up after his 11 years in Bronxville. Normally, when I give a talk on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it runs 50 minutes, and I feature the part that I care the most about, which was his encounter with the black social gospel at Abyssinian Church in Harlem. However, today I have 20 minutes, and we have my treasured friend Reggie Williams here to talk about Abyssinian, so I'm going to do what I was asked to do, which is to put Bonhoeffer in his theological context during the year that he studied at Union Seminary, 1930-31, as a Sloan postdoctoral fellow. When Bonhoeffer came to New York, he had just completed his habilitation thesis at the University of Berlin. a little gem titled Act and Being. His theological lodestar was Karl Barth, who became famous in the 1920s by condemning the entire tradition of liberal theology. Bonhoeffer asked two questions in his thesis about the nature of revelation. Should revelation be conceived in terms of acting, God is the one who acts, or of being, God is the one who is? Or is there some way to conceive revelation as a reality prior to these transcendental and ontological categories? Karl Barth was the dialectical actualist, contending that God's knowing is the creative origin of the world. Bonhoeffer was a Barthian who did not accept Barth's position on this issue. He allowed that Barth found a way to preserve God's freedom from the world, but at the price of losing God's inner continuity and the continuity of God's relation to the world. When Bonhoeffer came to Union, he respected that Union was the world's leading proponent of activist social gospel ministry, and he hoped to engage Union theologians on the issues he interrogated in his thesis. But Union was a bitter disappointment to him because, as he famously wrote, "This place has no real theology." We need to define liberal theology and the social gospel, even though that will cost me half my time. Liberal theology, whenever it arose in Europe and North America, rested on 6 defining planks. It sought a third way between orthodox authority, religion, and skeptical disbelief. It insisted on the right to intellectual freedom, denying that any external authority should establish or compel belief on any particular thing. It accepted the historical or critical approach to the Bible. It allowed science to explain the physical world, ending the conflict between theology and science. It looked beyond the church for answers, and it sought to be relevant in the modern world. The greatest tradition of liberal theology, by far, was in Germany, a story that began with Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Schleiermacher in the 18th century. This tradition was embattled, but still dominant in the 1920s when Bonhoeffer studied at Berlin. The social gospel was the argument that the church must commit itself to ethical and political struggles for social justice. Period. That's the social gospel. Liberal theology and the social gospel were two different things. It was possible to advocate liberal theology while opposing the social gospel, or the other way around. In fact, that was the norm in Europe. Most liberal theology movements in Europe did not support the social gospel. In England, the social gospel was called Christian socialism, and its leading proponents were Anglo-Catholics, not liberals. In Germany, it was only a very conservative form of the social gospel that melded with liberal theology. But in the USA and Canada, liberal theology and a progressive, politically activist social gospel folded together as one thing. In the churches that identified with Union Theological Seminary and Yale Divinity School, the social gospel, in effect, became the 7th plank of liberal theology. Union Seminary was the epicenter of it, and young Reinhold Niebuhr in 1930 was the epitome of it. When Bonhoeffer came to Union, he was open to the social gospel, but appalled by the liberal theology that Union espoused, until he witnessed a black social gospel version of it at Abyssinian Church. Bonhoeffer had come from a high bourgeois family of high achievers who looked down on religion. His father allowed that a bit of culture Protestantism might be good for society, but mostly for the low achieving, and only if it served the regnant bourgeois order. Bonhoeffer decided on a theological career when he was 13 years old, shortly after his oldest brother, Walter, was killed in World War I. His grieving mother supported him. His father was dismayed with stoic reserve, and his two older brothers were disgusted. To them, any time spent on theology was an embarrassment for the family. Bonhoeffer was able to study theology in the first place only because liberal theology retained considerable prestige in German university culture. One of his teachers, Adolf von Harnack, was a world-famous scholar. He had other teachers at Berlin, Reinhold Seenberg, Karl Hall, Adolf Deismann, who were distinguished scholars. Bonhoeffer turned against them in 1925, joining the Barthian revolt against liberal theology, but he greatly admired his teachers as scholars. This fact is crucial for understanding the very insulting things he said about Union professors and students. He knew what illustrious liberal theology looked like, and Union was a far cry from it. Yet there he was, trying to learn how to make theology relevant to social action. American theology was not very interesting in the 1920s. Certainly not by comparison to Germany. In Germany, theology was important, dramatic, controversial, and abounding in the language of crisis. The first name for the Barthian revolt was crisis theology. It was a reaction against the slaughter and destruction of World War I, the pro-war boosterism of liberal German theologians, and the conceits of bourgeois culture. Karl Barth declared in 1920 that before the kingdom of God could become real to modern Christians, quote, there must come a crisis that denies all human thought, unquote. German theologians, from Schleiermacher to Harnack, conveyed that they were comfortable with God and proud of their sophistication. Crisis theology was about shattered illusions and the experience of emptiness before a hidden God. Nothing like that occurred in the USA. American theologians did not have to interrogate the trauma, humiliation, disgrace, and colossal destruction of a world war fought on their native ground. The U.S. tried to stay out of the war. Liberal Protestant leaders campaigned against intervening. After the U.S. intervened in the war in 1917, most social gospel leaders preached Wilsonian sermons about saving the world for democracy. For a while, they even celebrated that the war turned the USA into a great power. You don't get a crisis theology out of that. We did, however, get a different kind of social gospel after the war turned out differently than progressive Americans had expected. In the early 1920s, leading social gospel ministers like Reinhold Niebuhr and Harry Emerson Fosdick repented of the pro-war sermons they gave in 1917. They were ashamed of these sermons, and they vowed to never do it again. Bonhoeffer studied at Union just before Reinhold Niebuhr changed again, now turning against the idealism and pacifism of the 1920s. The Great Depression created an American crisis theology formulated by Reinhold Niebuhr. But that occurred just after Bonhoeffer's year in New York had ended. Bonhoeffer was shocked by Union and the church services he attended. At least German liberals still grappled with Christian doctrines and wrote distinguished books about them. Bonhoeffer took courses in philosophy of religion with Niebuhr and Eugene Lyman, systematic theology with John Bailey and Henry Pitney Van Dusen, practical theology with seminary president Henry Sloane Coffin, ethics with Niebuhr and Harry Ward, and church and community with Charles Weber. It galled him that Union professors dismissed doctrinal theology as an outdated enterprise. They asked him breezy, clueless, not really interested questions about Barth. somehow looking down on Barth without fathoming what made him a towering theologian. Local clergy were even worse, preaching topical sermons that never mentioned the cross or resurrection. Bonhoeffer tried to explain to Union professors and students why Karl Barth mattered so much. Barth had saved him from Union's fate. Moreover, Union's brand of liberal theology was inferior to the kind that Barth and Bonhoeffer had disavowed. William Adams Brown, the leading Union theologian for 30 years, and Arthur C. McGiffert, Union's president and teaching star during its takeoff years, had studied under Harnack at Berlin and were pure Harnack proteges. They taught that Christianity is based on the person and gospel of Jesus and nothing else. Historical criticism strips away all the myth and dogmatism that Christianity piled on Jesus and his religion. Bonhoeffer recognized that Union's brand of liberalism was gospel-centered. It was not scientific naturalist or ultramodernist, such as at the University of Chicago. But to him, it was so stripped down that it didn't deserve to be called Christian. He said it over and over in the letters he wrote home. To his friend Helmut Roebler, Bonhoeffer wrote that American liberal Protestantism was infinitely depressing, shallow, frivolous, and trivializing. A week later, he allowed that Union seminarians are certainly friendly. They even expected professors to be friendly. But talking to them, quote, never yields anything of substance because Americans are averse to substance and truth. There is no theology here. They talk a blue streak without the slightest substantive foundation and no evidence of any criteria. The students are completely clueless with respect to what dogmatics is about, unquote. He said church services were much the same way. Quote, the sermon has been reduced to parenthetical church remarks about newspaper events. As long as I've been here, I've heard only one sermon in which you could hear something like a genuine proclamation, and that was delivered by a Negro, unquote. Well, that was a breakthrough. Bonhoeffer caught that gospel truths were existential to Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and his congregation at Abyssinian Church. Overall, however, the case for despair to him was just overwhelming. Bonhoeffer puzzled at the American pride in being shallow. He pleaded that liberal theology doesn't have to be shallow. Look at Germany. It seemed to him that something distinctly American was the problem, although he couldn't figure out what it was. Roebler wrote back to him, "Don't be the arrogant German," he said. "Things are terrible in Germany. All the nationalist parties are surging. Even the Nazis are surging." Roebler said, "It's nice that Bonhoeffer treasured high theology, but the Nazis had high theology too. Pay attention to what's happening." Political reality did get his attention, especially after he returned home. But meanwhile, at Union, Bonhoeffer stewed over American shallowness, which drove him to study the pragmatism of William James and John Dewey, the two foremost American philosophers. There he found what he considered to be the answer to his query. James taught that philosophy holds reality no better than a net holds water. Ideas are true according to their practical usefulness. Concepts are habits of belief or rules of action. Ideas are like knives and forks, enabling useful action. They don't refer to some truth. To Bonhoeffer, that explained how it was that Americans thought they could be anti-intellectual and intellectually advanced at the same time. American pragmatism was a school of philosophy that actually rejects philosophy. It reduced thought to a teleological function, the service of life. It reduced the idea that truth is the norm of all thinking. For Americans, truth wasn't normative or even valid. It was merely whatever worked. Bonhoeffer wrote that American pragmatism, quote, is precisely the destruction of philosophy as the question of truth, unquote. He said Union Seminary was so pragmatic that no member of the faculty taught or even understood how Paul and Luther conceived Christianity. According to him, Union had 4 groups of faculty. The socialists clustered around Niebuhr and Harry Ward. A churchy group gathered around John Bailey. Lyman was the ringleader of the philosophy and culture group, and Charles Weber led the church and society group. Niebuhr, to Bonhoeffer, was fascinating, bristling, and incomprehensible, regaling classes with barrages of opinion that swirled around just everything except God. Bonhoeffer would sit in the front row, take a few notes at the beginning of class, lay down his pen in frustration, and stare imperiously at Niebuhr, who caught that Bonhoeffer looked down on him. Niebuhr had 0 doctorates, and Bonhoeffer had 2. Bonhoeffer tartly asked Niebuhr whether Union was a theological school or a school for politicians. Niebuhr pushed back, declaring that Bonhoeffer's concept of grace was too otherworldly, way too Lutheran, and ethically truncated. That was a foretaste of Bonhoeffer's later critique of cheap grace, though he never acknowledged that he owed this particular debt to his enduring and loyal friend, Reinhold Niebuhr. Bonhoeffer's year at Union was enormously beneficial to him because of the friendships he made. He befriended 2 social gospel socialists who spoke the language of commitment that he respected. United Church of Canada minister John King Gordon, who went on to co-found the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation of Canada, and Methodist doctoral student James Dombrowski, who went on to work with Miles Horton at the Highlander School in Tennessee. These were the 2 most radical Christians that Bonhoeffer ever met. He also befriended Erwin Sutz, a Reformed seminarian from a German-speaking Swiss canton, and Paul Lehmann, a Norman Thomas socialist and later a prominent theologian at Union. Both had a passion for Barthian theology. Reggie will talk about Bonhoeffer's relationship with A. Franklin Fisher, who took him to Abyssinian. There, Bonhoeffer got his reward for coming to New York. A 4th friend, Swiss Reformed seminarian Jean Lesser, was a pacifist heading toward a career in the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. Bonhoeffer had never known an absolute pacifist and could not imagine a Lutheran pacifist. But Lesser and Abyssinian Church got to him, especially after he went home. Bonhoeffer did not see in 1930 what was coming. He had a stump speech on war that he gave several times to New York church groups. It was friendly, peaceable, defensive, and wildly optimistic. He said the Germans gave no consideration whatsoever to another war. It astonished him that Americans kept asking for assurance on this issue. Another war was out of the question, he said, because the German youth movement was powerful, insurging, entirely pacifistic. It was what he called an enormous power for peace. German youth stretched out their hands to Americans out of love for Germany and the desire for peace, he said. He stressed the importance of loving one's home, urging that if Americans, Germans, and others loved their homes more than they cared about politics, there would be no more wars. This call for peace idealized the very youth movement that surged into the Nazi Party and lifted Hitler above conventional right-wing nationalists. Bonhoeffer's resolve to confront the real world of political thought had barely begun when he returned to Germany, where he realized that his year at Union had influenced him after all. Thank you, friends.
I now would like to invite forward Dr. Mary Ellen Schmieder, who I met for the first time today, and I already know we're going to be friends. So Mary Ellen, welcome, and she's going to share some wonderful personal stories around Bonhoeffer.
Well, I'm old, but I'm not quite old enough to have known Bonhoeffer. But I did know the Confessing Church in Germany after the end of World War II, because from a very young age, this girl from a small town in Wisconsin, a Norwegian American, second generation, who by high school had been the District Luther League president and went to leadership training school at St. Olaf, and then thought, that's where I'm going to go to college. And so in 1956, when I began my undergraduate years, the kind of thing you've just talked about was what was swirling in the religion department, where we all had to take basically a minor in religion, whatever else we took as a major, and I loved it. And so the names of Bonhoeffer and the Cost of Discipleship, Karl Barth, Niemöller, anyway, the whole list were very much part of, especially Religious Emphasis Week, when we had special speakers and a real focus in the chapel hours every day on the issues of what it meant to be a Christian in the world, an educated Christian in the world. My freshman year, the summer of my freshman year, I was asked to be a youth delegate to the Lutheran World Federation meetings in Minneapolis. LWF was founded after World War II, and it was a way to build the church as an international commitment to ecumenism and engagement of people. And so the first meeting had been in Sweden, the second was Minneapolis. And the man who presided had also spent 3 years in Dachau and then was transferred to Buchenwald, but survived the war, Dr. Hans Lilja, the Bishop of Hanover. And so when I was 19, I sat through all the meetings of this remarkable body, trying to figure out how the church could be of use in the world internationally, ecumenically, and confessionally. Before the meetings of LWF, we had the first Lutheran World Youth Conference at a camp in Minnesota. Summer in Minnesota is when everyone goes to camp on one of the 1,000 lakes or 10,000 lakes. And so there I met mostly German young people, and I learned a lot about Germany at that time that I hadn't known before. And one of the things was that one of the young men who was becoming a young pastor, and I said something about him being a German, and he said, "I'm not a German boy, I'm a Bavarian boy." Germany was not a united, there was no united sense of place yet. Another young man who was there at the time became my colleague. We were both on the founding faculty of California Lutheran University in 1961. And I taught with him, and he was going on to theological school in California at that time, and he became a lifelong friend. Some others did as well, but those two stand out as two of the Germans who connected across cultures and ended up becoming Americans of German background. Well, 2 years later, I was asked to go on a Lutheran World Federation study project, 10 weeks long, in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Berlin, and West Germany. When we were in each country, we were meeting with leaders in the student Christian movement, mostly Protestant, mostly Lutheran Protestant, and you hear those countries named, the state churches in most of them, as well as listening to government leaders and trying to understand church and state across Europe. I was 21. When we got to Berlin is where things were different. Let me set the scene just a bit. We got into Berlin flying low in a great big wide Pan Am plane because you couldn't drive across much of East Germany to get to Berlin. And of course we landed at Tempelhof and were taken into a safe house in the Grunewald, the bankers' district of Berlin. There we were met by 23 East German theological students who had managed to quietly get through the checkpoints into Berlin. It was before the wall, remember. We're talking about ancient history here. They managed to get into Berlin, and to us, they'd been chosen through Otto Dibelius, the presiding bishop in Berlin at the time, to come to this meeting with American students. There were 15 of us. We were from all over the country, several backgrounds. One became a nuclear engineer who was on Johnson Island watching the last A-bomb we ever exploded in the air because he was working with the materials of that. There were a lot of interesting young people in that group of 15. And here were these 23 theological students. They'd gone to 6 of the 7 major universities in the East Zone. The church was, or the theology schools were still in the universities at that time because it was easier to watch what was going on if they were there rather than meeting quietly in someone's basement or backyard. And so these students were meeting one another for the first time, but they were also seriously wanting to be part of the life of the church after World War II. 2 of them, however, were caught at the border, questioned rather broadly, and finally explained where they were going and what they were doing. They never got to us. They immediately went back home so they could keep their places in the university. And Bishop Dibelius got the notice from the Stasi, such meetings with Americans are not possible. End of story. So there we were in our safe house with dogs in the yard, and every time we went out, we came to recognize our minder. Berlin was a very dangerous place in 1959. In fact, I've read the book that says the most dangerous city in the world was Berlin in 1959. We were moving up toward the wall, moving up toward 1961 when things really settled in. In fact, we went to Marienfeld, the refugee refugee center. There were 10,000 people crossing the border to that center. They were piling them in the beds. We met people lined up to come in the door, finally having gotten to the door in West Berlin to be free of East Berlin. There was a real exodus of people because things were so bad at that point. In fact, we met one young family. They had just arrived, their little daughter with a broken arm. And the man had been a teacher of English some years before. And so we sat down with him and heard the first debriefing of his getting to Berlin and getting out of East Germany. So it was really a pretty heady time. And among other things, I don't know if you all remember the old dragnet, da, 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 da. Well, I had that ringing in my ears the whole time I was in Berlin. It was such a fraught atmosphere the whole time that it felt a little bit like we were going to be in one of these detective stories that didn't turn out well. But the fact is, the one thing we did that was extraordinary was we quietly took the U-Bahn across Berlin into the east. The only thing standing that we recognized at all as a building in East Berlin before we got to the church was Stalin Street, which was right along the border. And it was obviously built as a show place, new apartments, but there were no lights on them ever. And no one lived there. No one could afford to live there in East Berlin. But we had Stalinallee with Stalin's sculpture at the end of the street. Then we got in further into the east, and the opera was about this high off the ground with grass as high inside the middle, flattened. The rubble was gone, but there'd been no rebuilding. The Reichstag was gone. In fact, there was very little standing in East Berlin, and then we got to the Marienkirche, the Mary Church, 14th century, full of shrapnel holes, but alive and well, and run by Propst Heinrich Gruber, also one of those in the confessing church during the war. He had been a pastor before the war. He'd worked in social services. He worked with boys' school and so on. And then he was, during the war, interned in Dachau for 3 years. And then he was let out alive. He came back to do his work in post-World War II Berlin. And the first thing he did was try to build a nursing home for Jewish people who had survived the Holocaust and were old and basically homeless in the wrecked city of Berlin. And so the ecumenism and the wish to include everyone in society and to be a genuine person among persons who were in trouble and in danger. And so there was Gruber working with the Jewish community as best he could to effect good things after the war, 1959. This is in Berlin. He outlived Bonhoeffer. He survived the camps, as had Hans Lilje, and continued to serve in their ways. He died in the late 60s, but he had been the only non-Jew to testify in the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. The other person that I got to know who testified in the Eichmann trial was Raoul Hilberg, who is Jewish, has now passed away, and who was best man when my husband and I got married. So I got to know Raoul very well because we taught together at the University of Vermont for several years. So it's a very interesting way. And I'm reliving, by the way, early years of my life here. My husband of 52 years died 3.5 months ago, and he was a first-generation American of German parents whose mother's 2 brothers went to Buchenwald after the war as guests of the Russians who had taken over the camp and had done as well with it as the Germans had done with it during the war. So there are 2 Buchenwald histories. One is Buchenwald and the Jewish Holocaust. The other is the Russians running that as a work and death camp after the war. And the one brother was seen going by naked on a cart dead about 2 weeks into it. He was the oldest brother of the family, and his brother knew he was never going to survive another round. He was an older man. They'd both been in World War I and they were farmers in East Germany. The second one came out weighing 89 pounds after several years, and with all of his body having eaten his fingernails for protein. He died about a year later, and so we visited his grave when we visited the family home in East Germany after the wall was down and one could travel there again. My mother-in-law was born about 8 kilometers from the Grenze in Erbenhausen in the Rhön. So there's a lot of history all wrapped up in all of this. And of course, for my husband, it was, how do I deal with this as a German-American human being? And where does my faith and where does my understanding of this world come together? And of course, he came to the place where most came to in the end. That is, this was all of us. We were all involved, all of us in all our societies who can let the world go this way and let these things happen, this Holocaust, this war. And he went, however, to a couple of the conferences of the Holocaust in the churches in this very ecumenical time, half a century ago, and did papers on how to come to terms with the unseeable. And of course, there he met the grandson of Wagner, who was trying to do the same thing, trying to see that his great-grandfather, the great musician, wasn't just talking about a superior race, but his music went in a different way than it was beyond that. And he, too, was trying to find some kind of peace and answer to what had happened in this terrible time in Germany. Back to Berlin in those years, the theological students we were with were committed to what they were doing. They were committed to rebuilding the life of the church in East Germany. As I say, they were in the university rather than having to be in someone's garage trying to study the Bible at night. And we were never able really to find out what happened to them ultimately, because no one dared give an address. We couldn't have written anyway. The letter would not have gotten through. When I visited the prison in East Berlin, where journalists and many, many people were interned after the war, taken off the streets in West Berlin, there were places where all the letters that were ever sent to anyone in East Germany piled up day after day after day in this prison. And of course, when someone had some time on the staff, they'd look through them and see if there was any dangerous, anything you could find. And I know now that the archives of that period are open. I understand you used to run those archives when they opened. I need to talk to you about that a little bit. I actually wrote Lutheran World Federation headquarters in Geneva the other day, and I said, do you have any names and people that in fact, I wanted to make sure that Merkel's father, Angela Merkel's father, of course, was a Lutheran minister, and had worked in East Germany, but he had been farther along. He was a little enough older than I, so that he certainly was not part of the group, but close, not too far apart. So, and I do understand from what I've read is that there's nothing in those archives that implicate him as anyone who is doing anything that was behind the scenes not as honest and forthright in his service to the church and to his faith. So anyway, you've got these wonderful people who remained in the confessing church, who saw it as needing to be more broadly organized, more broadly ecumenical, more broadly inclusive, more broadly international, more broadly living the life of grace that one's been given because one is here by God's grace. The other part of it is that the church, when we went on Sunday to the Marian church, was filled to the walls with worshipers, 1959. And the songs and the liturgy of the church were there. And Gruber, I can't remember in detail, but I know it was really, of course, it was all in German. I was 21, and I was trying to learn some German as I was on this trip, obviously. And but he also recognized the Americans in the audience and was so grateful that we had come and wanted to learn and share our lives in this way. No one in the church blinked or looked at us, and of course the people from the 23 students, and we all had to go absolutely separately from the safe house to the U-Bahn and back. We never blinked at one another. Talked about the weather more than I've ever talked about weather in my life in English, because you just knew you couldn't indicate you knew anyone. It was very dangerous. And after the service was over, everyone disappeared into the walls of the city without a word. There was no after-dinner coffee. There was no conversation. There was no communal gathering. They were there and worshiped, and it was dangerous. I went back to the Marian church with my husband in 2000. We got to Berlin again after the wall was down, and we'd visited East Germany, and we'd seen where his mother was born, and the wonderful little picture of Luther on the naif of Luther on the walls of the little church. And we got to the church. It wasn't on Sunday, and it was filled with books about the old Berlin, the stories of Berlin, and the Yiddish Berliner dialect. And I wish I had that book still. They really celebrated the relationship of the Jewish population along with the confessing church population. And there was all this material and memorabilia from the time. I went back to the church in 2012 when I was chairing the Fulbright Association and was introducing people at the international conference, staying at the Park Hotel, which is 30 stories high, right next to the Marian Church. And the church looks about this big next to that hotel. But there's a lot of East Berlin that is still not fully grown up or rebuilt. In fact, we were there in 2000. Clinton was going to come, and they were still laying the stones back, the cobbles, on the way to the Reichstag. It wasn't yet complete. And, of course, things hadn't yet moved to Berlin as capital again. But anyway, when I went back in 2012, I could not find in the "Welcome to Berlin, this is what you can do here this week," there was not a single mention of religion or church, anything. And of course, most of the churches had been turned into museums to visit. And I finally went to the desk and I said, "It's Sunday. Isn't there something going on at the Marian Church?" And she said, "Well, I don't know. I'll have to check." It was right next door. And so she went to check, and she said, "I guess there's a service at 10:30. So I thought, I've got to get there. I've got to see what's happening in the Marian Church. It was half full. And almost everyone I met at a really active and wonderful coffee hour after the service, friendly and so on, almost all of them were East German from the small towns visiting Berlin, and that was where they came, because that's what had been there, and that's what they knew. I have one other bit about that. After 1989, one of my husband's cousin's children was confirmed in the church in Wolfachhausen. And her cousin, who came from West Germany with me to this event, said, "This isn't a confirmation, it's a coronation." The church was filled to the gills. I was sure I was going to die if there was a fire. I was way up in one of the old sections. Everyone was there, and it was back to the clearly theologically solid and sound traditional fathers, priests. And they were all questioned the night before, as you need to be, to make sure you can be catechized appropriately. And there they were. There were 6 of them. They were confirmed, and they were able to go back to school. Things were getting better. And in fact, this young woman went west to Freiburg and has an MD degree and is a doctor in the West. So there were some who had stayed in the church as much as they could and hadn't been able to do much with their educations, and things were opening up in a way that was very exciting to some of the families there, that they could now worship in public and be people of faith again in the world. There's a lot to say about a lot of it, but this is foundational. This ecumenical, inclusive, dialectal church with embracing the world became really important. Lutheran World Federation really is now about almost a century old. It has its archives in Geneva. And of course, the World Council of Churches became the other great area of involvement worldwide in the question of religion in the world. And my professors back at St. Olaf, one of them was in the Jewish-Christian dialogue. The whole time he was teaching, he would go off to Geneva and go to meetings and then come back and talk to us. So everyone who didn't do what I did, which was go on to graduate school and be involved in this kind of way in the church, went into Peace Corps or went into the Civil Rights Movement. Many of my classmates ended up going south in the summer of '63 and being a part of people of faith working in the social ministry of the world. That's the story.
I'd like to now invite forward Dr. Reggie Williams. In preparing for this program, I was researching all over the place about writings about Bonhoeffer, and I stumbled upon your book, Reggie, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. I got it out of the Mount Vernon Public Library. I read it, I'm fascinated by it. I know you're going to share that with us today. But sometimes you just don't know who might say yes to an event, so I made a cold call, cold email to Reggie, and he graciously agreed to be here today. So, Dr. Reggie Williams, welcome.
Well, when you've been sitting for a while, and we've been here for some time this afternoon, you hope that the last speaker will keep it short. And I promise not to have us linger much longer than we should. I want to thank you, Pastor Clover, and everyone, as Dr. Dorian also said, everyone who's responsible for putting together this event. It is an honor to be with you in a part of the state that I've never been, in looking at these beautiful views here, and I've just had a great time. Normally, when Gary Dorian is speaking, I'm just taking notes. So I'm just sitting taking notes, and I'm not kidding. It is a bit humbling to have to be up here having to talk about a subject that he just talked about. Yeah, so anyway, I'll do my best. I bring you greetings from McCormick Theological Seminary, where I am a professor of Christian ethics, and from the International Bonhoeffer Society, where I am a board member. When Dietrich was here, he followed the mother and son, Richard Erns and his mother, you may know this already, as he had befriended them on the boat over the SS Columbia. He was very good. Now that sounds like it could be creepy, but it wasn't creepy. He was friends with them. He made friends with them on the boat, and then met the father, and he stayed in contact. I read for this event a very sweet letter that he wrote to Richard once he got to Union, where he surprised Richard and said, "You probably thought I would have forgotten about you, but that's not so easily done with me." He was 24 years old. Dietrich was. He had been a pastor in Barcelona, Spain, in between his dissertation and his habilitation, which was a second dissertation that you have to write in order to qualify for teaching at the university in Berlin. He had completed both of those by his 24th birthday. That's when he met them. They had spent some time in Switzerland, came over to the United States. And he continued in that friendship for some time. Now, what I want to do with us in these last few minutes that I have to share is I'm going to share just a little bit about the conditions of the church there in Germany. You've already heard quite a bit of a really solid foundation. A little bit of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Abyssinian Baptist, and then a particular event that happened during his time at Abyssinian Baptist that I think is a really interesting foreshadow for what he would go through in the confessing church struggle. Now, if you don't know much about what I mean by the confessing church, this was a church that stood over and against the Nazified German Protestant church. The German Protestant church wanted to synchronize all areas. They were among the groups that wanted to synchronize all areas of the government under the strong leadership of the Führer, under Hitler. The confessing church pushed back against that. They said they were the actual church. The government is the left hand of God, the church is the right hand of God, the two don't mix. The church should not be under the Führer. And Bonhoeffer was a member of this confessing church movement. So just to say that as I begin here. So I'll be taking pieces, just a few segments from my book as I present for you this afternoon. Normally I have all kinds of setup and PowerPoint and so forth, but I will be reading, and I hope I don't put you to sleep. So the conditions in Germany post-World War I, it's important to know that Dietrich was 8 when World War I started. He was 12 when it ended. 2 brothers went off to war. Father was proud that brothers were going off to war. If you've seen the movie All Quiet on the Western Front, it's a good depiction of how much excitement there was in the air about the war. Mother was not so excited. One brother came home. He was wounded. Walter was killed. From that moment on, Dietrich carried his brother Walter's Bible. Now, why would he be carrying Walter's Bible? What kind of conditions would they have a Bible if this was not a church-going family, which it wasn't? Not a church-going family. Because they were part of the upper middle-class elite in which most folks did not hesitate to baptize their children and confirm their children, but church was a part of culture, not confession. Walter had Walter's Bible with him, and he carried it with him from that moment on. That's when he declared, shortly afterwards, that he wanted to be a theologian. And the church was, again, it was part of the upper elite culture, moneyed culture. The Bildungsbürgertum, as the term is used. He, as a member of this Bildungsbürgertum, was interested in church, interested in theology, which was kind of ironic. Nevertheless, as he sought to be involved, as he sought to be a theologian, he was speaking into a church condition that didn't have much to say about the plight of Germany post-World War I. He would walk to school, as he would tell in his stump speech about the war, and see people downtown wearing clothes made of cloth and paper. It wasn't uncommon, even in this very wealthy family, to eat bread made of flour and sawdust. He would walk over a bridge, as he would describe it, where it wasn't uncommon as well to see people having jumped to their death. What does the church have to say to these conditions? Not much. In 1930, after he had completed his dissertation, his habilitation, he had pastored for a moment, he wrote a letter to the now existing German, I'm going to get this wrong, exchange office, right, for exchange students. I think Manfred is going to be the president of this next year. Yes. In which he described why he wanted to go across the sea to the United States and study. And in fact, his arm was twisted because the person who was in charge of his ordination process wanted him to go across, to go and study English in addition to have some experiences abroad because he was so young. He said this, that he wanted to study theology as it was developed under circumstances different than our own. He was then heading to New York, where he did not have the same kind of requirements that had been on him before for the dissertation, for the habilitation, for the first lecture, and so forth. He would study under different circumstances where he had obligatory lectures and obligatory textbooks, and these things ruffled his feathers. And he was a very sharp, as we already heard, and arrogant 24-year-old. He was, as he stated, looking for a cloud of witnesses, something that would help him to know, and he was thinking at the moment between the church for his career or the academy. Which is the direction that he will go? Does the gospel say anything to one's entire condition? Does it speak, can one, as he said it, as he would put it, can one put their entire being under the gospel? Where do we find this? Well, he was disappointed, as you've already heard, in his experience of Christianity initially in white churches, as he would say it. The white Christ and the black Christ was language he used. The civilizing, liberal representation of the gospel was somewhat of a chaplain for the modern project. It was a civilizing, cultural project, making a way in between, again, I've got my copious notes on Dorian's work, making a way between atheism and fundamentalism in a liberal enculturing project, a project on culture. There was little use for the language of Jesus, sin, salvation, and so forth. It was very similar to the culture of Protestantism, just not as sophisticated. Friendship specifically with Albert Franklin Fisher, ushered him into this theology as it had developed under circumstances completely different than our own. Fisher's family was very well educated. Fisher's father was the pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the church that was bombed in Birmingham, where the four little black girls were killed. He was pastor at that church when it first opened its doors there in Birmingham. He got his master's degree, Fisher's father did, from what is now University of Chicago Div School. His son completed his undergraduate degree at Howard University prior to coming to Union in 1930, where he met Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now I know some of this from my own friendship with Fisher's family. Assigned to Abyssinian Baptist as a constituent of what would be his Master's of Divinity degree. In those days, it was the Bachelor of Divinity degree. Bonhoeffer took a tour of Harlem in October, shortly after he arrived there in the second week of September. Took a tour of Harlem, and Abyssinian was on the tour. He later would accompany Fisher to Abyssinian Baptist, as he says here. For more than 6 months, I was in one of the large Baptist churches in Harlem every Sunday at 2:30 in the afternoon, and together with my friend Albert Franklin Fisher, and often as his substitute, had a group of young Negroes in the Sunday school. I conducted Bible study for some Negro women, and once a week helped out in a weekday church school. Hence, not only did I become well acquainted with several young Negroes, I also visited their homes several times. This personal acquaintance with Negroes was one of the most important and gratifying events of my stay in America. He was not just a visitor in the pews. He was a lay leader at Abyssinian Baptist Church. If you want to know what's going on in the community, sitting down with the sisters and a weekday Bible study will help you understand what's happening there. Abyssinian was founded in New York in 1808. Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the pastor of that congregation during Bonhoeffer's years, was pastor there since 1908. During the Great Migration, he was pastor. When the congregation was in its fourth building since its founding, he was a well-educated minister of the black social gospel message of hope. The interpretation of church for this congregation was derived from the black social gospel tradition, which is a post-Civil War manifestation of a pre-war black abolitionist faith. They were less concerned about the civilizing project, more concerned with the lived Christian response to abusive conditions for black life that emerged after the Civil War. Here I read a bit more about Adam Clayton Powell Sr. When Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. became the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, it was located in Lower Manhattan on 40th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenues, in its third building since its founding in 1808. Shortly after he assumed leadership there, Powell realized that Abyssinian must move to Harlem. He was not the first pastor of Abyssinian to reach that conclusion. In 1901, one of his predecessors, Reverend R.D. Wynn, was so convinced that the church should be in Harlem that he resigned after a 16-year pastorate when the congregation refused to move. The following year, in 1902, Dr. C.S. Morris succeeded Wynn and was able to convince the church, but in 6 years, Morris got the church to move only as far as 40th Street from its location at Waverly Place before he too succumbed to frustration and resigned. That's where Powell comes in. Powell took the helm on New Year's Eve, 1908. He agreed with his predecessors that Harlem was where Abyssinian needed to relocate and began the push in that direction. Powell's brand of pastoral leadership and ministry ministry focus was different from that of his predecessors, and as a result, the future location of the church was inevitable. Under the leadership of the stalwart Powell, Abyssinian opened its doors for dedication in Harlem at 138th Street between Lenox and 7th on May 20th, 1923. It had taken 115 years and the resignation of 3 pastors, including Powell Sr., before the congregation surrendered to the unavoidable, begged Powell to retake the helm, and moved to Harlem. Harlem was a destination of choice for black people coming from what was really war. They were, as it were, war refugees from the lynch law, from debt peonage, and a pestilence on the crops, as many of them were sharecroppers. Powell was insistent that what the church should do is pay attention to the plight of these black migrants. If we're not doing that, then we are not being the church. By the time he arrived there, Bonhoeffer in 1930, the church had 13,000 members, making it the largest black church in New York and the largest Baptist congregation in the world. The Great Depression was wreaking havoc on the nation. Conditions were worse for black people in Harlem. This is where I turn towards this argument. This is an incident that happened during Bonhoeffer's stay. It helps to highlight the work of Abyssinian Baptist. Here I will read a little bit lengthier section. Powell was very well known. He was actually an elector for the Republican Party at the time, a different Republican Party. Very different. And the church was very well known, as it was the largest Baptist congregation in the world. He had been preaching about active faith. He loved the phrase creeds and deeds. They go together. He had preached a sermon that had been, of course, he wrote his sermons out, and there was regularly a member of a black newspaper present in the church that would give a kind of an abridged version of the sermon, telling what happened on Sunday. He published one of his sermons called The Model Church, just about the time that the Great Depression was happening as well. It was based on Acts chapter 2. What is the model church and what does it do? And then this thing happened in public, as I'll read more about here. Pastor Adam Clayton Powell Sr. liked to use the language of creeds and deeds. For Powell, the call to demonstrate creeds was not only for lay people. He publicly demanded that church leaders demonstrate their creeds in the life they lived and in the causes of their church. In December of 1930, at the end of the first semester of Bonhoeffer Sloan Fellowship and the first full year of the Great Depression, Powell engaged pastors in Harlem in a creeds and deeds church struggle over the responsibility of black church leadership for the plight of black suffering in the Great Depression. The meeting was very contentious and would prove to be, in his words, quote, the most disappointing and discouraging chapter in my long public career, unquote. By the end of November 1930, Powell recognized that blacks in Harlem were, quote, facing their hardest winter since emancipation, unquote. The nation had abandoned the African American community, its most hard-hit population, and from all appearances, black leaders were guilty of doing the same. As the statement goes, when white America catches a cold, black America catches pneumonia. And the Great Depression was happening. During the first week of December 1930, Nannie Helen Burroughs, journalist, published a syndicated article in which she challenged black leadership in every organization including the preachers and the churches, to stop neglecting the condition of blacks. This is a lengthy quote from her. What on earth is the matter with Negro organizations? Church, fraternal welfare, and educational, national and state, that they are so impotent in the present economic crisis and industrial depression. The people are out of work. They are hungry. They are like sheep without a shepherd. Where are the leaders? What can the leaders do about it? They can do a great deal about it if they care a great deal about it. Religion isn't worth a cent if it does not give you overcoming faith. It is time for men who represent God to speak. Powell read this and was moved with compassion. Burroughs' rebuke revealed the apathetic and compartmentalized pie-in-the-sky Christianity within the black church community. This was the claim about black religion from a lot of black youth, especially during the Harlem Renaissance movement. You are so heavenly minded that you are no earthly good. You don't pay attention to the struggle that we are having against white supremacy. You're thinking about heaven, not earth, where we are suffering. Powell waited for a written response from the other New York clergy, and in the absence of a response from black clergy, for fear that silence may be construed as giving consent, he said, to the do-nothing attitude that Burroughs castigated, Powell, the bellicose social gospel advocate, went on the offensive. He did not defend himself or other black clergymen. Powell added a clergyman's voice to Burroughs' complaint by breaking into the columns of every Negro newspaper in the United States with rebuke. His response went further than hers to describe the blight caused by the depression in the black community, drawing on his access to information provided by the National Urban League, which he was a member, to illustrate his point. Quote, about 2 weeks ago, T. Arnold Hill of the National Urban League completed and published a survey of unemployment among Negroes in the United States. This report shows that about 1/4 of the colored people in the 25 large cities are out of work and hungry. This is not only a most pathetic challenge to every race leader and race organization, but every Negro individual who has a job and is living comfortably. If the churches do not answer this challenge, they ought to shut up and close up. Powell's public critique set off a powder keg in the black church community. He figured that, quote, since Jesus and the apostles led the world in caring for the poor and needy, I thought it proper and right that my plea should be made chiefly to the clergymen and the churches of all denominations. But his appeal was not welcome. As an insider's concern for the family of faith, many black clergymen interpreted Powell's public admonition as cheap notoriety. Powell intended his reproach as provocation that he hoped it would lead clergy to pay attention to the needs of the suffering poor in Harlem. Instead, the clergy returned his critique with some of their own. They came back at him, not kindly. But Powell saw himself as an advocate for suffering humanity. He understood Christ to be present in the encounter we have with the suffering of the needy. For Powell, Christians must not be complacent or apathetic, for to do so would be to ignore the very presence and need of Christ. 3 weeks before Powell wrote his contentious public appeal, he was mobilizing his church. This is where more of what I wanted you to hear about Abyssinian. He was mobilizing his church to relieve suffering in service to Christ. Just prior to his Christmas trip to Havana, Cuba, Bonhoeffer was most likely hearing the genuine proclamation of the gospel from a Negro. When Professor Dorian mentioned that he'd heard the proclamation of the faith from a Negro, it was this likely that he was hearing. He'd gone to Cuba for Christmas, but prior to that trip to Christmas, he was already at Abyssinian. At Abyssinian, when Powell preached 2 consecutive Sunday sermons, the first sermon called The Naked God and the next one A Hungry God, he indicated that suffering and the destitute population of Harlem was a consistent subject of his prayers and his lament to God for the poor, and returned to him as a directive from God. Powell says this. He's riding down the street in Harlem in a new car that the church had bought for him. The church is wealthy. Okay. There are many people at Abyssinian who didn't feel the Great Depression. They were still hiring people. And they bought him a car he didn't want, but he's in the car. He's driving probably Lenox Avenue. He sees the plight of black people suffering. He says, God, why don't you do something? He says he's sleeping a few days later, and in his dream he hears, Powell, why don't you do something? And as any good Baptist preacher does, he writes up a sermon series. That's his response. On Saturday, December 6th, New York Age, one of the nation's leading black newspapers that regularly had a seat in his pulpit, in his congregation, printed this excerpt of a hungry God. You and I can add to God's power on this earth. We clothe God by clothing men and women. Jesus interpreted this as meaning to clothe men and women when they are naked. When you give men and women coats, shoes, and dresses, you are giving clothes to God. If the Bible does not mean this, it does not mean anything. Last week, we gave out about 500 pieces of wearing apparel from the community house of this church. They were in the streets, giving out food, giving out shoes, hiring people, caring for the elderly. They were actively addressing suffering conditions in Harlem, where Dietrich was a lay leader. Powell accompanied his words of rebuke with action. When he preached a hungry God, he pledged 4 months of his own salary toward Abyssinian's unemployment relief fund to aid in the suffering caused by the Depression. The combination of his inspiring sermons and his personal sacrifice aroused the congregation to give abundantly. He says this, before I could finish delivery of the sermon, the audience was rushing forward, placing money on the table to feed a hungry God. One woman left her pocketbook containing a week's wages and walked home. Powell's sermons generated $2,500 in donation from his congregation, which in 1930 was a lot of money. All of which went to fund the largest, quote, the largest relief bureau ever set up by colored people, unquote. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was at the time a student at Union Seminary with Bonhoeffer, organized and directed Abyssinian's relief effort, which included a free food kitchen, a clothing giveaway, and an employment agency. By the end of Bonhoeffer's Sloan Fellowship year, Abyssinian Baptist had served nearly 30,000 free meals, sent out 525 baskets containing more than 2,000 free dinners, and distributed nearly 18,000 pieces of clothing and 2,000 pairs of shoes. This was a socially active community of faith that put the whole body under the gospel, a cloud of witnesses. So when he returns, I have an excerpt from a sermon here that I will save you now because I've been here for longer than I intended. This witness of a church that has a response to human suffering was with him. The activity that he engages in on the other side of this church leads him into actual church involvement in Germany. He becomes a member of church involvement, actually an active church involved Christian, which is something that people who knew him before recognized this is a different Dietrich. And he is active as a Christian in the relief of suffering, as we know, that leads to, as Miles Horton, one of his friends at Union Seminary says, I saw in him an excitement from his involvement in Abyssinian that likely led to his death at the hands of the Nazis. Thank you.
Friends, it's been a very full afternoon. I know we've been in the pews for a while. I'm going to call an audible, and I've learned in my years in ministry that ministry is a lot about calling audibles. That is a little change of play. I was going to invite the speakers up for a Q&A, but maybe the thing to do is if you're able to join us in the back for a reception, that people can approach you one-on-one for any questions they might have. Does that sound okay with everyone? We have wonderful refreshments in the back, and before we end, I just want to thank today's co-sponsors. This is sponsored by 1014, This Space for Ideas, co-sponsored by the U.S. Alumni Association of DAAD, the European Union Study Center of CUNY Graduate Center, and German Fulbright Alumni EV. And also, I just want to thank everyone in this congregation who has contributed to the success of the event. So thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for coming, and join us for some great, I think, German chocolate cake, amongst other things in the back. Thank you very much for coming today.